for a 9-month well baby checkup, and his hemoglobin was a little low, and the doctor said, give him iron, come back in 3 weeks. We went back in 3 weeks, and she basically said, go down to Children's Hospital and see the hemo doctor. We had seen the doctor, and his bone marrow was so compacted that they said there's something wrong, but it was so compacted they couldn't even get a sample. And so later that evening they had told us it was a leukemia.
He actually got admitted that night when we were at the hospital back in March. They started the typical chemotherapy.
After his first round of chemo, his numbers never come up. They want them to have an ANC of like 500 before they'll allow them to go home. And his numbers never came up and never came up, and finally they let him go home for a day. And that night, or one night at home, he ran a fever, and we ended up in Shady Grove emergency room, and the next day they told us he had relapsed. He had a lot of chemo and radiation to his brain. His relapse was in his central nervous system, so they irradiated his brain at age 1 year, which they said right then is not the best thing you can do. This is where you learn how generous people are.
He was 6 days post-transplant. His organs started to shut down. He had trouble breathing. His kidneys weren't working. And he was at a point where it was really dire. And they were giving him some new medication. And all of a sudden, his body finally started to respond. And I know the doctor said to us long after, a couple months later, it really was a miracle how his body started to change. They were really, really concerned. And Lori and I just kind of looked at each other, and we were just like, really? Because we didn't realize. And they looked at us and they said, you guys just had such a good attitude about it. I guess because we just didn't know what to expect, and we were just hoping for the best.
Ignorance was bliss. They said, y'all never gave up hope on him. And we're like, we didn't know we were supposed to. I mean, this was our child.
Hannah was born on January 21st, and she was a healthy, happy baby. Through her toddler years, she was always kind of happy and caring and just a sweet little girl. A few months before her 5th birthday, she had hit her hip on the coffee table, and we looked to see her hip, and it was just a little red mark. And later on that day, that night when I was getting her ready for bed, Tom was out on travel, I noticed that the spot where she had hit her hip was about 3 inches in diameter, a bruise that was blue, and it was black, and it was swollen. So I immediately...
She called me.
I called Tom. I was crying, and I said, something's wrong. I know something's just not right. And so he flew home right away, and we
went to the pediatrician, and they looked at her, and they did a urine test. And they said, we're going to have you see someone else. So they sent us over to Fairfax Hospital, and we were admitted into the hospital, which was kind of confusing. And then we met the doctor, and the doctor examined her and felt her lymph nodes, her stomach. They drew blood, and at that point they took us into another room and said she had leukemia. The good part about that, and I guess this is where the society comes into play, is they said, we're going to cure your daughter.
Her protocol actually called for 108 weeks of treatment, and she had to have chemotherapy through her central line and through pills, and she actually also had to have radiation.
Yeah.
Even though it wasn't in her spine.
Since it wasn't in her spinal fluid, they reduced the amount of radiation, or RADS they call it. They made a mask for her to keep her in place, and they administered it on both sides. And the mask would bolt down to the table, and then she would get radiation treatment on both sides. And she would stare up at the ceiling and look at these little lights as her little friend right here. That kept her company. Her last treatment was in the beginning of December, and she got her port out a couple of weeks ago.
It's good to have Hannah back as my playmate, and she's feeling better. And my angel. I like to play with her.
I'm happy to have my brother here. It's nice when that he's here, but he can be a little annoying sometimes.
I'm glad he's feeling better.
Thank you, Candace!
Thank you for raising money for kids with cancer just like me.